Hello, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about our sponsor, Anchor, hopefully at a louder volume this week. First of all, it's free and it has creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. I found it really easy to move the segments around in the editing process, and you can put the ads in wherever you want too, which is really helpful. And Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. This has been super helpful with the success of my first episode, having it on all of these platforms for you guys to listen to. And Anchor does that for you, which makes it super easy. And you can make money from the podcast with no minimum listenership, which is perfect for people like me who are just starting a brand new podcast. So it's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. If you've been thinking about a podcast you want to start, this is me encouraging you to do it. All you got to do is download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm. That's ANCHOR.FM to get started.
Welcome back to another episode of Navigating Adulthood and IDD. I'm so excited today to have Jen Hicks. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you.
And today is our third and probably final episode of our mini supervision series. So I'm really excited to conclude with you and to dig more into supervision today.
Thank you so much for inviting me here to share this space and time with you.
Of course. So listeners, Jen is a board-certified music therapist, a licensed music educator, an experienced registered yoga teacher, and the owner of Joyful Noises, LLC. So Jen, would you mind giving us a short introduction?
Absolutely. So as Bonnie said, my preferred name is Jen, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I would like to start by acknowledging that I and my business are on the land of the Tohono O'odham Nation. And I also want to acknowledge that I am a white, heterosexual, enabled, highly educated, middle-class, cisgender female with a history of trauma and a brain injury. As Bonnie said, I've been a board-certified music therapist and a licensed music educator for over 25 years. I'm also an experienced registered yoga teacher and the founder of Joyful Noises, LLC, and MT Mentor. And in addition, I'm a sister and an auntie and a daughter. I'm a wife and a dog mom, a friend, a foodie, a cyclist, a traveler, a reader, and a lifelong learner. My core values are joy and gratitude, cultural humility, connection and community, holistic wellness with the WH in holistic as described by Dr. Renee Linklater, and service and education. I love personality inventories as a way to increase my own self-awareness. So for those of you interested, my strengths on the Strengths Finder are communicator, achiever, input, learner, and positivity. I'm an ENFJ, and I'm an Enneagram 1. I also love talking about vision and mission work. And so just to let you know a little more about me beyond just the titles and the educational background, my vision is to create courageous communities that encourage cultural humility, lifelong learning, gratitude, and living in the and to inspire joy and holistic wellness. And for me, living in the and embraces complex and nuanced, non-dualistic thinking and belief. And really holding space for that and is something that I've learned from my own therapist. As I'll share as we go throughout our time together, I believe strongly that we as therapists need our own therapists. And I'm grateful for mine and for all that she has taught me. My mission is to use my foundation of music therapy and mindfulness-based principles to inspire and empower students, professionals, and clients to experience and create joy in their lives through living in the and through prioritizing their holistic wellness, to create courageous communities built on cultural humility where all are welcomed and encouraged to grow and where cultural intersectionalities are explored and honored, and to support the music therapy community as we seek to move our profession forward through guest lectures, presentations, supervision, service, and opportunities like this one today to get to share with all of you. So thank you again for having me.
Of course. I'm so excited to talk with you, Jen. And that was such a great introduction. I think it's really clear your values are, you're very passionate about them. And it's really nice to hear them lined out. And I'm sure we'll hear them reflected in our conversation today too. And then my brain went in a couple of different directions. One, this podcast loves yogis. I think I've had at least 2 on, but Christine's been on a couple times too. She's one of my really good friends. So yoga's very welcome here, I think. Well, she even says, Christine, that music is yoga because of all the principles of yoga. So I'm always very excited to have another yogi.
Thank you. There are a lot of connections. I actually did my master's thesis research on music therapy and mindfulness-based practices. I also do want to honor, because I think it is important to name the way that yoga has been appropriated.
Right.
And to honor that it is a spiritual practice that has been handed down from teacher to student as part of ancient South Asian Buddhist and Hindu practices over the years. And I think it's really important to name that and honor that. And as you bring it up in the spirit of those practices, I just will extend my own deep gratitude to my teachers on that journey: Karen Murray, Michelle Lynn, and her teacher, Sri K. Patabi Joyce, Govinda Kai, Lynn Shook, Indu Aurora, Matthew Sanford, Ami Kunimura, Dr. Shyam Ranganatham, Professor Dr. Samati Sundar, and Dr. Sangeeta Swami. And for those folks who aren't familiar with Dr. Swami's work, Sangeeta wrote a chapter in the Whitehead Plow and Tan book on, and I always forget, I have an old version of it without the correct title, but I can look it up.
Yeah.
I've got it on my desk.
We can put that in the show notes.
Cultural Intersections in Music Therapy is the correct title for that book by Barcelona. And Sangeeta wrote a chapter in it on South Asian practices that I think is really helpful for music therapists in particular who do find those connections like you talked about, because there are many. And I've presented over the years about those intersections between yoga and music therapy and mindfulness-based practices and music therapy, and finding a way to do that still honors the history of those practices and that finds a way to borrow and share aspects of those practices without appropriating the specific practices themselves is really challenging and complex, which, as I mentioned in the intro, I love embracing. I love that complex, nuanced thinking that is so important in our world. And I think a lot of times folks want things binary and easy and simple, right and wrong. And it's not that simple. Life is really complex. And that is definitely one of those topics with a lot of complexity and nuance. And I was really grateful that Sangeeta was part of my thesis committee as I explored that for my master's thesis, because we dug deep into those connections and how those show up, not only in our work as music therapists, but in a way that is helpful for the clients with whom we work.
That's awesome. I'll make sure that's in the show notes. Thank you. I think that was a really important acknowledgement too. Yeah. And Christine's really good about that as well. I feel like she's always educating me, because she has also had a lot of teachers and training, not just the appropriated Western version of yoga.
Yes, absolutely. And I know most of the folks that embrace those intersections do. And it's part of what I think it's, as you said, important to name and keep as part of the conversation so that there's space for that within the conversation.
Definitely. Awesome. Well, I feel like that could be a whole other podcast episode. We discovered another topic, but we'll shift back to supervision for today. But I mean, there'll be overlaps, I'm sure, even with supervision we discuss, because it can be really complex too. And being reflective of biases and burnout and things we'll dig into, and that has its own complexity as well.
Absolutely. And even thinking about I'm really excited because Haley Francis Can is going to be sharing a workshop with our MT mentor community coming up. And so we've been diving into anti-oppressive practices and being aware of the power differentials and the ways that our areas of privilege and minoritization show up in all aspects. And just like there's appropriation in yoga and there's that potential for harm there, the same thing is true in music therapy. The same thing is true in supervision. And so again, just being aware that potential and being open to being called in or called out and continuing to learn and grow, because we are all learning and growing and we all will be. And I just think that is so important. So yeah, definitely a lot of overlap.
Definitely. And we discussed before in emails that you really wanted to be transparent with this podcast too, that you don't necessarily work with adults with IDD. So I just wanted to say that for that transparency, but I still think your insights and knowledge on supervision is going to be really important for all professionals. So if people are listening specifically for working with adults with IDD. I think we'll see that overlap so that professionals can be reflective and support our clients ethically and authentically, and continue to provide the best services possible. And
Absolutely.
I thought of you for this episode because of your MT Mentor podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, I was like, I feel like this series is kind of like my spin on it. So because you dive so deep into supervision in your podcast. So we'll make sure that's in the show notes. But I'm really excited to learn from you and for you to share your knowledge today.
Thank you.
Of course. Let's get into it. What has been your experience with supervision? You can explore both as a supervisee, as a supervisor, really whatever direction you want to go in.
Thank you. I am just so grateful for all the experience that I've had as a supervisee, going back to my very first job as a certified nursing assistant back in around 1991, I think. So back then, to all the positions that I've held as both a music therapist and a music educator, the wisdom that I've learned from my mentors and my supervisors has truly informed and influenced the person that I am today and the person that I am becoming, not only as a music therapist and as a supervisor, but also as a human being. And that is true as well for the opportunities that I've had to serve as a supervisor. Those have really formed me and continue to form me. I've had the opportunity to supervise music education practicum students and student teachers, as well as music therapy practicum students and interns. I also co-created an American Music Therapy Association national roster internship site with Lindsay Markworth of Twin Cities Music Therapy Services, and I've served as director of that site for the last several years. And that was a wonderful opportunity for those of you in the music therapy world who have considered having an internship. Lindsay and I put our two businesses together because when we looked at our own internship experiences, we both had many aspects of the internship that we were grateful for, and we both wished that we would have had a more diverse experience in a lot of ways. And so Lindsay primarily works one-on-one. She works a lot with autistic children and adolescents and folks of all ages with different disabilities. I work primarily in groups, and I specialize in working with adults with co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. We both have very humanistic foundations to our work. Lindsay is also Nordoff Robbins trained, and I have some music-centered leanings. And we really wanted to give interns the opportunity to explore improvisation more deeply, as well as pre-composed and recorded music more deeply. And we wanted to have them work in one-on-one situations and group situations, and to give them just a more complete experience in our perspective, as well as the opportunity to see how two different businesses operate. I am very intentionally a sole proprietorship. I have an LLC to provide some separation legally with my business, but it is me. And I'm intentional about keeping that way. Lindsay has more than a dozen employees now, I believe, and operates in a very different way. And several of her employees now serve as supervisors for the internship site as well. And so it has been exciting for us to give students that opportunity too, to see that music therapy can look differently and music therapy businesses can look differently as well. You mentioned the MT Mentor podcast, and really that was my goal as someone who has always loved learning from the mentors and supervisors and supervisees in my life, to have the opportunity to interview folks in the music therapy world about their experiences and to have those chances to learn and grow based on the wisdom they have to share. And for those that want to check it out, we'll link it, I'm sure, in the show notes. And if you go to my website at joyfulnoisesllc.com, there's a drop-down menu that you can access the podcast from there as well. And it has just been really exciting to get to talk with music therapists at different places in their journeys and with different areas of expertise, and to have the chance to continue learning and growing. And so I think that's one of the important pieces for me as a supervisor who is still supervised. I still have my own supervisors and coaches and mentors in my life too, to remember that both of those roles are critical for our growth as we move forward in our profession.
Yeah, I love that emphasis on like the value of learning and growing and how you can experience that as a supervisor or a supervisee. And I'm in the same boat where I'm in both positions now too. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely like that learning experience to keep us growing as clinicians.
Absolutely.
And my mind is blown by the internship thing. That's amazing. I think listeners know, maybe not, but my business is Rhythmic Roots Music Services, LLC. Same thing as you. It's just me. I don't really see myself hiring anyone anytime soon, but would love to have an intern one day, but have no idea how I would hit those hours, like to qualify.
Exactly. Yes.
And then, yeah, it just really diversifies that experience for the intern too, versus just being under one business. They could see a lot of different populations. They could learn so much, and kind of that's a really cool experience you've provided to allow almost like maximum growth for your intern.
That's been our goal. We also made it a 10-month internship rather than a 6-month, and we're intentionally part-time, and we create the schedule with each intern so that they're able to work at the same time. As business owners, we are not in a place financially, particularly after the pandemic and during the pandemic still going on, to be able to provide a full stipend as we wish we could. So we really are intentional about creating an internship where interns also have space and time to work, and separate time for that, as well as support around self-care and some of the things that we're going to be talking about. We're also really intentional with supervision. So the intern has supervision alone with all of their supervisors. And then once a month, we have a combined supervision session with all of us together. And that's been really powerful too, to get to see the different relationships that we have with different supervisors and how those interact, and yet to also really stay focused on being a team. Right. And we've developed some processes for really clear communication and organization to work with all of those different folks together. I will also say it was, for Lindsay and I, creating the site was a really incredible journey in vulnerability, because part of creating an internship site is having a music therapy philosophy and a supervision philosophy. And I had my own, and Lindsay has her own, and trying to put them together and go, what do we believe? And what do we both believe? And being willing to be courageous and have those difficult conversations, going back to what we were talking about earlier of that complexity and nuance. Those initial conversations between her and I really set us up for being able to also have those conversations with interns and with supervisors over the years, and to create that space. I really love, there's a poem called Invitation to Brave Space by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. That is one of my very favorite poems. When I was in person for clinical work, I had it in all of my session rooms. I've used it to start presentations often, and it talks about creating a brave space rather than a safe space. And as someone with a history of trauma, I've always hated the term safe space because we can't guarantee that for the clients or for ourselves. But I love how Mickey Scott Bay Jones approaches brave space. And that's really been our goal with the internship site as well, is to create these brave spaces for interns to grow and for us to grow along with them. I can say that we have been affected by every single intern, and our internship site has changed with every single intern. And to create those brave spaces in the podcast I do, to create those brave spaces in the MT Mentor community that I am creating with those members, it has been really powerful to see what that looks like in different places. And that's really, for me, when I was thinking about my vision, and I redefined my vision at the end of 2020 because of all the changes in our world and in my own life. And I kept coming back to this idea of creating courageous communities. And that's really what my vision is. The most simplified version of my vision is creating courageous communities. And I see that in the clinical work that I do. I see that in the supervision sessions that I'm a part of. I see that in the podcast. I see that in the work that I do as a volunteer for the American Music Therapy Association. That's really been my goal, is that idea of a courageous community where we can learn and grow together.
Yeah. And like you were just saying, the courageous community, a brave space, is what we as therapists try to develop for our clients. And that overlap with supervision is so important too. Because you have to have those kind of spaces for that learning and that growth to be a positive experience and not an unfortunate supervising experience.
Because there will be challenges. If there are any students listening, right, or employees or anyone who has been a supervisee, there will be challenges. And some of that's good. I work a lot with interns, and just a shout out to Emma Munir, who has done a lot of presenting on the developmental stages of internship. And just being aware that part of that is there's going to be some conflict as the intern really develops their own sense of self and who they are as a music therapist and their desire for independence in that. There's going to be some conflict. That's a good thing. That should happen. And if we're not prepared for it as either the intern or the supervisor, it can be so challenging because there can be that resistance rather than embracing it and, saying, yes, like, yes, there's going to be conflict. Let's dive in. Let's talk about that. Let's explore that and see what ways we can work with that. Because the same thing, just like you're saying, there's those parallels in therapy sessions as well. And I do want to be really clear, that the role of a therapist is really different from the role of a supervisor. Right. And one of the things I always recommend with the folks that I supervise is that they also have a therapist. We often will say in our communities that that's one of our just check-ins of do you have a therapist? Is there someone else that you can reach to? Because there are pieces I can help with and create the space for and give you the opportunity to explore. And then there's other questions where they need to be taken to a deeper level with someone other than the supervisor. And so in the reflection form that I've actually shared with you, that'll be available for folks who are listening, that's one of the questions on there is what questions do you have for your therapist? And so that as students, interns, music therapists, as we are reflecting on our work and integrating it, that just becomes a part of the practice. There are pieces that we explore in supervision. There's pieces that we explore in therapy as well.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. So thanks for bringing that up. Again, I think it dives into the complexity of supervision sometimes because there are so many overlaps with therapy, but then it's yeah, but it's not therapy. And, then there's that boundary because the supervisor has a different role than a therapist. So it's so interesting, the spaces are kind of similar, but just understanding that those roles are going to have those nuances. But good supervisors tend to be really clear about that too. And in their forms are I'm not your therapist, but we'll work on things, we'll grow, but there's still that boundary to understand too.
And finding resources, I think it's important too for any supervisors listening to also help make sure that therapy is accessible for the folks with whom you're working. And, oftentimes if students or interns are still technically in school, technically taking credits for their internship or their practicum, there are free resources often through universities. There's also resources for therapists that have sliding scales. And so it's also one of the pieces that I always have on hand is ways to make therapy more accessible, because that can also be a challenge for folks. And especially in a field such as music therapy, when there are so many financial barriers, which I also just want to name, starting from, just the educational piece through the unpaid internships that are very common, through low starting salaries and high student debt and all of those challenges. With putting my hat on as co-chair of the AMTA Commission on the Education and Clinical Training of Music Therapy. Yes, I think that's the whole title. The Commission on the Education, Clinical Training of Music Therapists. That's what we are. It is one of those pieces that we have really started to dive into is how can we reduce some of those financial barriers in a way that's sustainable for our profession and sustainable to help us move forward with greater diversity and greater accessibility to the profession and greater accessibility to our services as well.
Yeah, that's another really good point because I think I talked in one of my supervision episodes. I don't know if it was my solo one or with Kate Shannon, but my first job, I ended up being contracted, so I didn't have any supervision, and I struggled. Yeah. And then there's another financial barrier because at the time I couldn't afford a supervisor, and now I have a supervisor I can afford, but I had to get to that step, and it was almost like working backwards because things are kind of easier in a way now with supervision than when I didn't have it. So that's definitely another barrier is supervision once you get into the field too.
Yeah. And I think that distinction between contractors and employees is always an important one too. I know Jen Pinson has done a lot of presenting on that topic, and she actually presented for our MT Mentor community on it. And I specifically encouraged anyone who's entering the music therapy job search to really understand that, because like you said, if you are a contractor, you're the person who's contracting with you, who's not actually your employer because you're a contractor, not an employee, they can't legally supervise you.
Right.
And so, so it's one of the pieces where when you look at why contractors should get paid higher rates, it's because as a contractor, you're having to pay for a lot of things yourself that are built in if you're an employee. And understanding, again, all those pieces can be really important, and understanding the value of them. And I think supervision is one of those, we talk a lot about, taxes or insurance and those aspects, but we don't often name what a resource supervision is as an employee, particularly if your employer is somebody who is a skilled supervisor and one that you want to learn from and creates those opportunities.
Yeah. And Kate Shannon and I talked in the last episode. We were like, at least for an employee position, that could be something you really explore as in your interview with them, is to like ask them what kind of supervision will they be giving you, what kind of style, like who's it coming from? Because that's not necessarily what I would have asked, starting as a new professional. It's like, how much am I making?
Yep.
Like what XYZ, but like supervision wasn't on my radar, and I wish it would have been, I think, as a brand new professional.
Oh, absolutely. It's so important. And I think it's really important at different stages in our careers too. Very important as a new professional. And I know it's something I still find value in. I utilize it differently now in my life, and it's still really valuable too. And what you need is going to be different. So like you said, knowing the questions to ask when you go into those interviews to make sure that your needs will be met is important.
Definitely. So what has been your favorite part of supervision?
You may have guessed this. I love learning. Is anybody shocked that I love learning?
I think I wrote that down. I wrote love learning.
See, that's me. I also think, because mindfulness-based practices are such an important part of my life, one of my favorite questions to be mindful of and to reflect on and to explore is why. And supervision involves being really mindful, because having worked with practicum students and student teachers in music education, as well as practicum students and interns in music therapy, you are going to get asked why a lot. Why do you do this way? Why did you start that way? Why did you use this song? Why? And serving as a supervisor gives me the opportunity to make sure I know those answers, to make sure that I am being intentional in all that I'm doing, and to be really mindful in my clinical work and in my clinical decisions, and in honoring that therapeutic instinct that we have. And then it also gives that opportunity to ask that same question of the students and the interns with whom I work. And I always learn when I ask them about their choices, or why, or how, or tell me more is one of my favorite things to say, because I just love that opportunity to continue learning. And there's so many different, because we all come with our own lived experiences, with our own perspectives, with our own biases, with our own areas of privilege and minoritization, with our own intersecting identities, we all bring different perspectives to this work. And having the opportunity to really explore those questions is important. And it's also something that I really encourage the students and the interns with whom I work to also explore. On the reflection form that I use, there's basically 4 sections. There's a section for the positives, because I sometimes think we skip over those, of what is most meaningful, what is most effective, all of those pieces. What did you do well? I never fail when I go into supervision sessions. They're ready to talk about everything that went wrong, or that was challenging, or, quote unquote wrong. There's not really a wrong, but in their minds.
Right.
And so taking that time to really explore what went well and was effective and meaningful, and to explore the challenges, of course. And then there's a whole section of questions. And I really encourage students and interns and professionals to always be asking questions, to leave every session that we do thinking about, what questions do I have? What do I still need to learn? Where do I still need to grow? What do I wish I could ask the clients? What do I need to ask my supervisor? What would I ask my therapist? What do I need to reflect on just my own self as I move forward, to having those questions pieces? And then there's a moving forward section of, so now what? And what does that look like as we move forward? I think that question section, though, is so important. And that's something that we don't always teach. And I've had this conversation. I am not a parent, and I am not an expert on being a parent. And I will just name that. I love being an auntie, and I'm grateful for that opportunity. And I know parents get asked a lot of questions, right? And it's something that I think we need to encourage throughout our lives. I also think it's really important that we encourage all of us to have permission to answer a question with, I don't know. Because we're all learning and growing, and we're not going to have all the answers. And there's not necessarily going to be one right answer. And so I love that supervision gives us those opportunities to embrace the things we don't know, to dive into that discomfort, and to keep growing, to keep learning for all of us. And I think that is just so critical.
Yeah. Sitting in that for a second. I'm actually a new time supervisor. I just started this semester. So I'm both writing down notes for the podcast and some for myself. I was like, ooh, that's really good.
As I said, as supervisors, we're also always learning. So
Right.
welcome to the club. That's what it is.
Exactly. And I love that approach of the why in supervision, whether you're a supervisor or a supervisor. And I think immediately, even in my body, I felt something kind of light up, like get really curious. And I think that leads into the next topic that we wanted to discuss about where does burnout and sustainable self-care relate to supervision? Because at least with that question of kind of staying, exploring and curious, kind of like even like maybe trimmed off a little bit of my burnout. You're like, oh, like there's something here that doesn't have to be anxious, but like that we can explore and learn and keep it fresh and interesting for us and our clients and our supervisees. Again, supervision is not therapy, but there is that overlap.
Absolutely. And there's again that overlap with mindfulness-based practices.
Right.
Which are also really important in creating sustainable self-care. And part of that is being able to approach our lives and our work with compassion and curiosity and wonder rather than judgment. And so like you talked about, having that why mindset, having that curious, kind mindset can be really powerful in and of itself. You know, we also know as far as supervision in burnout and self-care, there's actually quite a bit of research both in and outside of music therapy on this. And we know that professional isolation, which I know a lot of music therapists have experienced, inadequate supervision, like you talked about from your first experience as a contractor, and a lack of support are all risk factors for burnout. And they're really common in our field. And so we know that supervision is one of the pieces that's highly recommended to reduce professional burnout and to increase sustainable self-care. Our MT Mentor community this month has actually been reading Ami Kunimura's ebook, Resilience Over Burnout. And that's something that she details is why that is so important. We also know that support overall is really vital in creating truly sustainable self-care practices. And I always talk about sustainable self-care practices because we're not just talking about, you know, a vacation once a year, although that can be really helpful. But we need those daily sustainable personal and professional practices that are just integrated into our lives to really, truly reduce burnout. So self-care as we know it actually was never meant to be practiced alone. Self-care was popularized in the 1960s by civil rights activists as a way of making sure that they had the spaces and the support to rest and recharge, so that they could have the strength to continue fighting and advocating. And so I think that's one of the common misconceptions with self-care is that it was never meant to be practiced in isolation. Self-care has always been meant to be community care. And that is critical for reducing our burnout, for building those sustainable self-care practices, both personally and professionally. And as we've been talking about, that support can take a lot of different forms. We know that human support is important. Dr. Vivek Murthy, who's our Surgeon General, has actually written a book on this. And he talks about how our need for community is a survival need, just like our need for food and water. It is literally that essential. And so we need human support. We also know that we need that support in creating safe enough spaces for us to be able to care for ourselves, right? Especially for those folks listening who may be taking care of kids or a parent, or we can't do this alone. We need others who are there to help give us the space and the time and the ways that we can care for ourselves. Also remember, and this is something Ami talks about a lot that I think is huge, supporting ourselves also means having boundaries and practicing saying no. And, you know, Ami details the different types of boundaries, which I love, that we need physical boundaries, we need time boundaries, we need, as music therapists, boundaries within our scope of practice. We also need energetic boundaries and emotional boundaries, privacy boundaries and music boundaries. So we need human support, and we also need boundaries. And we also need to acknowledge that human support is never going to be perfect. One of the questions I'll often ask in music therapy sessions with the clients with whom I work is, how many of you have ever been let down by somebody? And every client raises their hand. And then I ask, how many of you have ever let somebody down? And every client raises their hand, right? And I had one client who brought up, I've also let myself down, which I was like, whoa, we need to take a moment for that, right? We as human beings are not perfect. And so we also need other forms of support in our lives. We were talking at the beginning about our pets, which can be a huge piece for many of us. Hobbies, time in nature, faith and spiritual practices. We need other sources of support. And sometimes those are professional sources of support. And so we've already talked about, personal therapy or professional counseling. We also know that that can be one of the important ways to build self-awareness, which can also reduce burnout. So when we look at the things that have the most power to reduce burnout, self-awareness and our physical practices are two of the biggies. So physical practices being things like sleep, what we eat, getting enough exercise, those physical practices. So self-awareness is a piece that therapy can be really helpful with. And we were talking earlier about those differences, the nuances with supervision and therapy. So just to throw a couple other nuances into the conversation, I actually did some work, because I've presented on this before, defining all those different levels. So supervision is more formal and hierarchical. Generally, when it's offered through work or outside work, there's generally a power hierarchy in play. The exception to that are peer supervision groups. And that is something that I have found really helpful in my life. When I was initially starting my business, I looked into the Minneapolis, Minnesota community of music therapy business owners, and I invited 3 folks that I admired that I also thought similarly to me were looking at ways to build their businesses while also still having a life outside of music therapy, which was important to me. And so I ended up creating a peer supervision group with Lindsay Markworth, who we ended up creating the internship site together down the road, Mike Limbiblu and Andrea Gayton. And the 4 of us met initially once a month and then once a quarter for quite a while. And we would set goals with each other. We would hold each other accountable. And it was incredibly helpful. I also attend a peer supervision group that Rochelle Morgan runs called MT Insider, and that has been really helpful for me. And then we have peer supervision groups as part of our MT Mentor community too. And so that's one of the ways to have some supervision that's a little less hierarchical, and also that you can create yourself, that you don't need somebody else to provide for you, that you can actually reach out and create those communities. So there's supervision. And then there's coaching, which I've also really appreciated and used in my life, which it tends to be short term and very focused on a specific area of need. So when I was starting my business, Tim Ringgold was my business coach, and he was really instrumental in helping me to create a business built around my core values, which was important to me. And that coaching, though, was just needed for that short period of time while I was building my business. I also reached out to Lindsay and to Mike when I started to integrate more improvisation in my work, because I hadn't done a lot of improvisation before, and I knew that I needed a little extra coaching on ways to integrate that. So coaching is much more short-term, and usually there's a very specific purpose. And then there's mentoring, which also tends to have a specific purpose and area of need, but is longer term. And so one of the resources, if you want to include for the folks that might be listening that are part of the Great Lakes region, the Great Lakes region actually has a free mentorship program that is really awesome. And I've served as a mentor in that program for a while. I just stepped down from that role, and I worked with mentees, specifically one around session planning. So at a very specific purpose, but in a longer term way. And then I worked with another music therapist on really integrating their core values and what that looked like. And so I've had the opportunity to benefit from mentorship, from coaching and supervision. And I think it can be helpful to define them, because again, they kind of all get lumped together sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
And so that at least is helpful for my brain, which likes things organized.
No, yeah, those distinctions I think are really important, and make it really clear too, of like, oh, this is a coaching situation.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And you touched on it a little bit, talking about Ami Kunimura's resources. And I actually did buy that ebook early in my career when I was having a really hard time. And she has like a test in the ebook, and I didn't score very well. But it has these amazing categories that you don't necessarily think of for self-care. And one was even being like feeling understood, like in your job and like different things like that. So I definitely will link her resource as well, because I think it gives you different perspectives of self-care. And I hadn't heard the history of self-care before. So thank you so much for sharing, because I thought that was really important too. Because I think sometimes, probably because of capitalism, self-care does seem to be emphasized on the individual, like finding time for yourself. And that can be important too. But when you really need self-care, sometimes you don't have access to that. And so it's like, oh, we're not even supposed to do this alone. I think is important And thank you for sharing all about peer supervision too. We'll link a couple that you mentioned, but I also wanted to highlight and emphasize the point that you can create your own peer supervision, because that can be something that is more accessible for professionals, for new professional students, interns that maybe can't afford supervision, to get some of that financial aspect off. Is like, you can start with the peer supervision. It doesn't have to be the big supervision right away.
And I've even had interns in the past who weren't a part of a university that had an intern group that have created their own. And we've connected them, for example, in the Minneapolis community with other interns who are looking to connect and just have a chance, even just every other week or once a month, to get together with other music therapy interns and be able to talk about what you're going through and to get perspective from somebody else. It can be a really powerful thing to have those peer supervision groups. And again, to enter them or create them with some intention of the goals and intention of how you will interact together and engage together. And they can be really, really wonderful. So that is a piece that I have found incredibly helpful throughout my career.
Oh, yeah. And what I wanted to connect to back to Ami too, is you were talking a little bit about musical self-care. So what's the importance of musical self-care for music therapists?
Yeah. And definite shout out to Ami, because I know she's offering a special course specifically on this. So I know there's a discount right now, but I think it ends pretty soon. So depending on when this goes live, it may not still be there, but she is truly a mentor for me in this area, and someone I'm really grateful to have learned from. When it comes to musical self-care, Nate Mensa once said, "If you are not full musically, you can't feed others." And I've had those words resonating in my head ever since. And I just think that's so powerful for us as music therapists. And I'd really encourage any music therapy students or professionals who are listening to begin by just remembering why we chose to become a music therapist. Because for many of us, it was that strong connection that we had with music that led us to this field. And so when you think about feeling disconnected with music, that can have such a huge negative impact on us, both personally and professionally. We all still need to experience the power of music, and not just in our clinical spaces. And so I think it is really important to consider, when we talk about musical self-care, the role that music has in our personal life. Think about, when was the last time that you created music just for fun, or listened to music just for fun? Patricia Allen, who Ami also references in her work, introduced the term clinification in the art therapy literature to describe this transition that happens when we focus more on our clinical creative art skills and neglect our own relationship with those creative arts. So that can happen for us as music therapists when we only make or listen to music for work. And this is absolutely one of the things that can lead to burnout. And it can not only negatively impact our own relationship with music personally, but it can also really negatively impact the ways that we are able to engage and communicate with clients in the music too. So it can actually impact our professional work. And so, I'd really just encourage the folks who are listening to ask yourself, what is your music? Is there some music that you can save just for you? I was mentioning those boundaries that Ami talks about earlier, and one of them are music boundaries. And those are so important. And because I love ands, love the complexity and nuance, right? Just like with any other important relationship, our relationship with music and our musical identity and our boundaries around that are going to evolve throughout our life. And I think that's an important piece to know with sustainable self-care overall, including with our musical self-care, that we need to allow the space for the way we care for ourselves to continue to evolve and grow and change. And I know Ami and I actually had a wonderful chance to connect at the Great Lakes Region Conference in March of 2020, right before the pandemic really hit hard. Literally, the first case in Minnesota was identified while we were at the conference. And Ami and I had a chance to just chat while she was waiting to go catch her plane. And then when she did an episode of the Empty Mentor podcast with me. And we just talked about, for both of us, the ways that our self-care practices have had to change as a result of the ways that the pandemic has changed our world, the way that it has changed our own personal and professional lives as well. And so I think giving that space for the way we care for ourselves, including the way we care for ourselves musically, to evolve. When I worked more with children, I use the piano a lot, and piano is my primary instrument. I'm a classically trained piano player, and I've had to do some work around letting go of some of that perfectionism stuff that some of you might relate with. But I used my piano a lot in my clinical work with children. And so I did a lot of my musical self-care then through listening, because the music that the kids I worked with listen to and the music I listen to were very different. Now, because I work primarily with adults, the music that I listen to and the music that the clients with whom I work with listen to is often very similar. And so I've had to be a little more intentional. And I really love local singer-songwriters and finding some lesser well-known folks to listen to and support to find those spaces where I can have my own music. I've also reclaimed the piano because I don't use it for my clinical work right now. And so I keep my favorite Debussy piece open, and I've got Chopin nearby that I can just sit and play over and over and over again, and it just fills me up. I've got musicals. I've got a whole stack of musicals over there to play around with just for fun and just for me. And so I think it is just so important to find music that is just for ourselves and to make the space and time for that in our lives.
Definitely. And I have my marimba behind me, and it's been kind of a similar question where it's like, oh, I could use this in sessions, but I've really tried to hold off so that I can have that space for it. I do get excited when a client really likes a song that I like, but I think I love your advice too of really finding that music and identifying it as your own. I know for me, I love Idina Menzel.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like I'd be really surprised to find a client that loved her as much as me. So maybe that's the boundary.
Yeah. And like you said, it is fun to find those connections. I love that when that happens in groups. And right, there's that and again, that it's not a binary thing where it's like, oh, this is mine. It's gonna ebb and flow,
right? And
creating that space to allow for that, and finding different ways, and knowing that it's valid. Like you're talking about, that you could use the marimba. It's also valid to say, you know what, I'm not going to, or at least not right now. Maybe down the road that might change. For now, this is for me, and honoring that. Honoring that self-care is not selfish. And that we need to set aside that time, that we need to prioritize that we need to prioritize finding our communities, who those people are that support us in that self-care, which for many of us does include supervision. That is often part of that community when we talk with clients, we often think about the layers of our communities around us of family. And when we talk family, it can be the family that you are born into or that you grew up with, or the family that you create for yourselves, family, friends, significant others, kind of that personal community of support, but then also those professional layers of support around us, which can include mentors, coaches, supervisors, therapists, as well as other folks for the clients with whom I work, parole officers, case managers. It's just important to have those layers built, as well as then those pieces within ourselves, which music can be such an important one of those. And also knowing that we can build our own reflective and reflexive practices that can help to meet some of that supervision need even on our own. So for those of you who might be going, none of these are options for me, I can't do any of those, you can also build those reflective and reflexive practices yourself. Taking the time, just like you would with a supervisor, but taking the time with yourself, whether that's through journaling or processing through music or processing through art or other creative arts or whatever that looks like for you. I just think it is so important that we build those practices and ways of supporting ourselves within ourselves, as well as having those systems around us.
Yeah, I think that's important too. And then hopefully there's an option for everyone listening of what's going to work best with your life right now and resonate with you, to find that extra support, whether it is making music for yourself or finding peer supervision or investing in a supervisor, whatever level, finding what works best right now.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Jen, you've shared so many things. My show notes are going to be full and happy. I'm so excited.
I love resources.
Yes, I do too. And I love when I can talk to a guest and there's so many good takeaways for listeners. And so I really hope something will resonate with people listening, but there are so many good resources and really helpful things that you've shared today. So thank you so much. And before we start kind of closing, is there anything else you want to share before we kind of start wrapping up?
I think I just want to affirm what we've been saying here at the end, that if your needs for supervision and support aren't being met, I would just encourage you to reach out. It's become a bit of a joke amongst some of the Minnesota music therapy community, because there was a Music Therapy Association of Minnesota meeting several years ago where a music therapist was sharing that feeling of isolation that many of us have experienced of being on an island. And I was apparently feeling feisty that day, which, if you know me, is not unusual either. But I stood up and I said, "Get off your island." And I say that with all the love in my heart, knowing that there are systemic barriers, that there are community barriers, that there are personal barriers, particularly right now in the midst of a pandemic. And we have so many more virtual options now that didn't exist when I started in this profession. From the free podcasts like this one that folks can listen to and learn from, to a variety of membership groups that are based around different populations and goals, as well as what we talked about, that you can create your own peer supervision group and it can be virtual. You don't have to go anywhere. As I said, that's what I did when I started my business. I know that reaching out can be scary and it can be vulnerable. And it is so important and so worth it. And you are worth it. You deserve to be supported. You deserve to feel valued. You deserve to feel like you are learning and growing and to have the resources to do that. And I think acknowledging that own worth within ourselves and not being afraid to reach out and to ask for what we need and to create what we need. For me, it is what I did with the AMTA Mentor community when all of my clinical work suddenly went on hold. And I asked 2 questions. I asked myself what I love to do, what I'm most passionate about, going back to that vision and mission for myself. And then I also asked, what do we need in our music therapy community right now? And I put those 2 things together and created our AMTA Mentor community and created the AMTA Mentor podcast. And then when my clinical work came back, and I'm grateful that I'm now able to do all of that via telehealth, I also knew I couldn't maintain both of those. So if you check out the podcast, there are 10 episodes. There will be more someday, but I'm not prioritizing that right now. Because going back to part of supporting ourselves also means having boundaries. One of the agreements I have with myself is that I can't say yes to something new and just keep adding it on. I have to let go of something else. And so for right now, the podcast is kind of on the back burner. Lindsay and I also we love our internship program. And because of some life changes that are happening with both of us and some changes in our businesses, that's actually going to be on hold right now too for a little bit, which is part of that also allowing ourselves and our businesses and our personal and professional lives to evolve. And I think giving ourselves the space to do that is so incredibly important. And to know that not doing something forever doesn't mean it was a failure.
Right.
Right. That taking the lessons that we've learned, taking the gifts from that experience, and we will continue to apply those wherever we go. And so just, I would encourage those of you who need support to reach out and ask for it or to create it and to allow what you need to grow and evolve as you do. That can mean letting things go. That can mean putting different boundaries up. Emma Munir talks about how our boundaries one day can be totally different than our boundaries the next day, and that's okay. And that includes with our music. So I just encourage y'all. We as music therapists are wonderful advocates. We advocate for music therapy. We advocate for the clients. It is also really important that we advocate for ourselves and for our needs and the needs of our communities.
Definitely. Thanks, Jen. And everyone, get off your island.
Get off your island. It became a joke. So we actually a few of us did a presentation together called Get Off Your Island.
I think I've seen it, actually.
And again, I say that acknowledging the and of the, there's systemic barriers, there's community barriers, there's a lot of barriers, there's financial barriers like we talked about, and there are options.
100%. Awesome. Well, thank you, Jen. I'll definitely link AMTA Mentor and the AMTA Mentor podcast in the show notes. But where else could listeners connect with you or find out more about you?
So my website is always a great starting point. It is joyfulnoisesllc.com. So JOYFULNOISESLLC.com. And it has a drop-down menu where you can access the information on AMTA Mentor and access the podcast. Also, if you just scroll down on the homepage, you can sign up for my email list and receive a free infographic. I do periodic emails. Not super frequent, but when there's certain offerings that I think might be beneficial for people or to remind you of free resources that I have, every now and then we'll just reach out to that group. So it's not a big commitment to getting emails. Also, just a word on the AMTA Mentor community. We've talked a little bit around it, but just to let folks know what it is. So I created this community, this brave space, and what you receive as part of the community are weekly private office hours with me. So you can sign up on Calendly for 15-minute blocks of time, virtually or on Zoom or via telephone. We also have 2 different professional peer supervision groups every week. At 2 different times and days to allow for different folks to attend different ones. And then we have a student peer supervision group that has evolved into an intern peer supervision group that they now call themselves the semi-professional peer supervision group, because there's several of them that are starting to get towards the end of their internship. So we have the student intern semi-pro group. We also have a private Facebook community and private messenger threads. There's one for students and one for professionals that are just incredibly supportive. If you ever have those days where you just need to scream into the void, first of all, there's a website for that. By the way, I think it's just like screamintothevoid.com or something like that, which is awesome. You can link that in the show notes too, because it's so much fun. But we'll also just, having a space that you can go to ask a question or to share some wisdom or to just reach out and ask for support or to give support. That's one of the things I really appreciate. And then I offer monthly content packets or book clubs. And so we've covered topics like burnout and sustainable self-care. You can tell, obviously, that I'm passionate about those. Core values, vision, mission. We also explore things like bias, privilege, and appropriation a lot. As I mentioned, we're diving into anti-oppressive practices next. And we've also explored a lot of mindfulness-based practices and self-compassion and that musical identity and self-care piece too. There's also been some pieces related more to music therapy. There's content units on music therapy methods, on humanistic person-centered music therapy, on reflexive practices, and exploring trauma in music therapy. So a variety of different content. What I would say kind of defines our group is that it's a space that you get to bring your whole self. My dog is going to hydrate. So if you happen to hear that on the recording, consider this your invitation to also hydrate. That's what we do in our groups. When my dog hydrates, we all hydrate.
We all hydrate. All right.
Yes.
All good. I'll be editing out Queenie's litter box sounds later.
So there's a lot of content, but I think what really defines our group is that space to bring your whole self. So it's not defined by the clients that you work with or the setting where you work. It's a space where you can come and, we've got several parents in the group that provide support. Recently, they had a thread going on options when your babies start to eat real food. That was one of the things they talked about. We have conversations a lot about language. We have conversations about goals often for working with certain clients. So we do some of the typical music therapy supervision where you can bring questions you have about a specific client. And we also offer that space to bring our whole selves, whatever that means for you. There are reduced prices for students and interns. And one of the fun things is that those prices don't go up once you pass your CBMT exam. So if you join us as a student or an intern, you get to keep that price all the way through. And then what I encourage them to do is to consider paying it forward when they can. And they have options for that. And then we also have equity-based pricing for students, interns, and professionals from historically minoritized communities. So it was important to me because there are some of those structural barriers in place and systemic barriers in place, to offer something to help counteract that. So that's a little bit about that community. You can check it out again through my website or through the link that Bonnie will share. And then on social media, you can find me at Joyful Noises LLC or at MT Mentor 2020. Those are the 2 handles we use on Twitter and Instagram. And my Joyful Noises Facebook page is open. The MT Mentor Facebook community, though, is private for that group. So that is the only space you won't find that tag on. And I think that's it.
I was about to say, I see why the podcast is being paused. That on top of your clinical work, on top of your AMTA work, and maybe Minnesota work too.
I used to do some work with the Music Therapy Association of Minnesota. That's actually how I started getting more involved on a structural level in music therapy, and is through our state association, which I'd really encourage folks to do. It is always fascinating to me how much we don't know about what goes on behind the scenes, and learning from a state level and then going from there has really taught me a lot. And I'm hopeful that through my work on the commission, and I think I named it wrong, so I'm going to try this again, the AMTA Commission on the Education and Clinical Training of 21st Century Music Therapists. I think that's the full name. We just call ourselves the Commission because it's much easier. But I really hope that we'll be able to bring some systemic changes to our profession and help to reduce some of those barriers. And one of the things that we've talked about is the need for supervision. So it goes very much hand in hand with what we are discussing today, or very much in line with what we're discussing today.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, Jen, thank you for all that you do. One.
You are welcome. And thank you too, Bonnie, for all that you do and for this
Thank you.
podcast and for the invitation to share this time with you. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Yes. Well, thanks. And I also wanted to say thank you for everything you've shared today. I'm really excited to share this episode with everybody and for your time today, too. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome. Take care, everybody.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jen. I was so honored to talk with her and felt really inspired about supervision after our discussion. I'll keep our debrief here pretty short as I think the interview had so many great points and resources, and the show notes will be filled with a lot of resources for you to continue looking at as well. But 3 things I wanted to highlight real quick is that I loved that Jen has a love for learning. And I think that love for learning can keep us curious, not only in supervision, but in our practices and in our lives. And that curiosity of asking why, I think, was another point that really stood out for me in regards to supervision as well as the rest of our professional kind of careers, continuing to ask why and to explore and to be curious. And I left her point of living in the and, especially in the time of this pandemic. I think that is a really thoughtful and intentional way that we can kind of experience every day, feeling both the difficulty and the curiosity to keep learning, acknowledging that we can do better, and giving ourselves a lot of grace. So I really like that point from her too. And just near the end also, I feel like she gave really great examples of the differences between coaching and supervision and peer supervision, and hope that everyone can find a level of supervision that can help them with their self-care in their lives and their professional careers, and to get off your island. So that's my quick debrief of a wonderful interview of Jen. So thanks to Jen so much again for coming on. And real quick, to end today's episode, I'm going to go over the February music therapy session plan outline for adults with IDD. Hello, Just the Way You Are by Bruno Mars. Bucket Drumming, I Love Me by Megan Trainor. Winter Hot Potato, Music and Journaling, and then Goodbye, Thank You for the Music. So, if you are interested in the full breakdown of this plan, it is available for patrons on patreon.com/navigating adulthood and IDD for $5 a month. Other ways to support the podcast include sharing it with somebody you think would like it, following us on your podcast platform, leaving a review on your podcast platform of choice, and just continuing to listen to episodes. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, please email me at bonnie@rhythmicrootsmusictherapy.org. Thank you so much for listening. I'll catch you in the next one. This podcast is by Rhythmic Roots Music Services, LLC, with content and music produced by Bonnie Haupt. Thanks for listening.